their sound, this sound.
Yeah.
So what was it about the sound that dragged you in?
Apache, Kon-Tiki, Wonderful Land, all those tunes, those early tunes with that core sound I could hear in those records. So it's just something that just grabbed me. 36, 24, 36 was another one that grabbed me.
Yeah.
And even the bass sound was very, the sound as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was so different to anything else at that time. Yeah. What is that sound?
Well, what is that sound?
Yeah, what is that sound? That's a question many of us have been trying to answer for quite some time. And in fact, there were 2 or 3 different periods of evolution of the sound. I'm reading here off a sheet that we'll show you on the video in just a moment, which shows what tunes were recorded when and what equipment they used with it, because that's a key part of how we get it.
Yeah.
But briefly, up until from June 1960 up until towards the end of 1960 was the early vintage period, the Apache, FBI, Man of Mystery sort of period of that sound. Very aggressive, fairly thin sounding, but very characteristic. Then they moved into a slightly more mellow period with Kon-Tiki and Blue Star and some of those tunes, taking us through to early 1961. Then it really morphed again into sort of Sleepwalk, Wonderful Land, that period, going from mid-61 to about mid-62. The latest part of that early vintage sound was really sort of dance on through to Atlantis, which is the middle to the end of the 1960s. Then they took a fairly sharp turn when they started using Burns guitars in about 1964, 3 or 4, with the Rise and Fall of Flingle Bunt, The Miracle, Lost City, those tunes through till about mid-1965. Then they really moved away from that very early sound, and I think it's those early periods.
Well, it's the early ones
really
we talk about, really, because although there were lots of shadow copy bands around at that time, nobody seemed to quite get the sound that they did.
Yes.
Well, they did really, but let's say specifically. So what was it? What was this magical thing that not even he could seem to recreate
later on?
Years?
I mean, I think initially we have to acknowledge the mastery of Hank. I mean, he is a consummate musician.
Phrasing.
And the more and more you listen to those early records and try and copy them, the more you appreciate the sheer musicality.
The more you learn.
Yeah, the sheer musicality of the guy, the way he phrases things. It's just
it's made even more incredible by the fact he was only like 19 years old at the time.
Yes. And again, that came through in those early TV programs, where the guy's up there with half the world watching and he's casually knocking off riffs and things most of us would die for.
Yeah.
So that's an integral part, and we have to acknowledge that.
Sure.
Then there's the equipment they were using. As is well known, Hank was one of the first to use the Fender Stratocaster as a lead instrument, and that's part of the equation. Then there were the amplifiers that they were using. They had the early Voxes for Apache, probably the AC-15, then they got into more powerful Voxes as time went on, and they added their own part to the tonal equation as well. And a key part of the shift in sound from the early through the middle to the later vintage years is associated with those different Vox amps and the way they were voiced.
But it wasn't just the Vox.
An interaction effect between the guitars.
The key thing then was the echo unit. Hank was the first guy to use the Miazzi Echo-Matic, which was an echo unit made in Italy.
By happy accident, of course.
By happy accident, yes. He just happened to hear one, was it Brown?
Joe Brown, who had one and didn't like it.
Yeah, didn't like it, and Hank heard it.
And Hank heard it and thought, that's really, really nice, I like that. And it just so turned out it had this particular magic.
So you've then got the 4 key ingredients. You've got Hank, you've got the guitar he was using, you've got the echo unit, and then you've got the amp.
Interaction,
At the end of the day, the final cream was also added by Abbey Road. Probably their recording techniques, I think, were also an integral part of it.
Post mixing and the big plate reverb,
and the reverb room they used in the early days, the microphones they used in the early days, which most of us can't afford now, can't even get. So they're the essential components, I think, of that sound.
So it makes it hard to try and copy it, doesn't it?
It does, but a number of people now are really starting to get fairly close to capturing it, and we like to think that we're in that group as well. And that requires a whole number of things. One is really understanding the tune, understanding the music. Where is the emphasis on the notes? Hank didn't just play the notes like he's joining the dots. he was playing music.
He was playing the tune.
He was playing the tune.
Yeah.
And so I think playing the tune is where you start, and that's in your head and in your technique and all of those things. Then there's the guitar you're using and its setup, what strings has it got on.
Heavy strings.
Heavy strings.
Seem to be.
Yes.
1359s.
Yes. Well, Hank in the early days could only get heavy strings, and nobody thought anything more. And this was part of the happy coincidence.
Yeah.
Again,
And who knows how long he kept them for?
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an important point Spiro raises. If you listen to the early records and compare those to what it would have sounded like with new strings, with that wiry thin sound, they were clearly well-used strings that were giving it.
And actually very important toward the sound that we've come to know now.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Then there's the setup of the guitar. The early tunes, Apache, certainly Man of Mystery, The Stranger, when you listen to it, the notes are fairly choked. They don't have a long sustain that most of us would want to achieve these days. So if you've got a lovely American Strat set up for a lovely long sustain, you're going to struggle to get that early sound unless you actually artificially damp it down.
Yeah.
Then there's how you attack the strings. Hank uses now, and probably used then, a fairly heavy pick.
Yep.
And if you do the simple experiment of trying to play a number with a light pick, you get a thin, clicky sort of a sound.
Yep.
With a heavy pick, you get that solid, woody sound. So we generally use 1.3 mil picks, often Dunlop or George Dennis.
Yep.
So we've got the guitar, we've got the man in his head and playing the music, then we've got the guitar properly set up with the strings.
Yeah.
The pickups on the guitar are important, but they're not probably as fundamentally important as many people think.
But from the experiments we've done, the thinner the sound,
Yes.
the better it would seem.
Yes.
You kind of fix it, because you play a tune low and it sounds really nasty, but by the time you've recorded it and processed it, you get closer to the sound with a thinner sound to start with.
Yes, and this is indeed a paradox. I've actually played the original Strat when the Shadows were over here rehearsing for the last leg of their world tour. Actually got hold of Bruce's guitar, Cliff's guitar, Hank's guitar, who claims ownership of it at the time, and played it. And it's a very thin sounding guitar. And if I walked into a guitar shop and picked it up and played it, I'd probably put it back on the shelf and go for something that had a more mellow tone.
Mind you, the strings would have changed since then, but you would think.
And Bruce is using thinner strings now. But the point Gary makes is absolutely fundamental. It's a very thin sounding guitar. And the nearest I think I've heard to it in a production instrument it was the one released by Oasis Music.
Oasis.
In England just recently. They did a limited run of reissues using supposedly the original Ibarra Abigail pickups. And they too have this thin sort of a sound. As you say though, once you play it through the echo unit and the amp and knock off that treble, you get that beautiful growly mid-range, which is again characteristic of that sound. So I guess an early piece of advice is don't go for a pickup that sounds nice and mellow.
It's a difficult one though, because I mean, although what you say is true when it comes to recording, from a live point of view, sometimes those thin sounding pickups are a bit hard to pick. And
you've got to adjust the tone of them. You can't just plug them into an amp and a PA because you'll get that rip your hair off type ice pick treble, which most of us don't like. Then the big thing is getting a pickup that's not really too mellow and that's lacking in that real sharp bite and that attack. That's why I said I thought pickups were of secondary importance rather than primary importance.
I tend to agree with that.
Then of course there's the amp that you're going through, and we've found that again, if you understand how the tone controls on the amplifier work, and depending upon the speaker fitted to it, you can get quite a good Shadows sound. You get a good one with your Roland. I've managed it with a Fender Deluxe Reverb. Spiro has a Laney with a different speaker fitted. They can all get you fairly close, but at the end of the day, if you really want the last 5 or 10%, you've got to have a Vox, and you've got to have probably a Celestion speaker in the Vox. The early Voxes used a Goodman's, but most of us can't access those anyway. So that's another key part of the kit. And as I've said, the different Voxes over the different periods are also fairly critical. So for the early period, Apache, Man of Mystery Stranger, Gonzales, it's my belief that they probably used an AC-15. Now, you can get a fairly similar sound on a modern AC-15 using the normal channel, or you can get a fairly similar sound using a Vox amp fitted with a top boost channel. You have to turn the bass and treble fully off. Because that's the only way you get mid. The top boost channel set up normally has a large dip in the frequency response at about 800 hertz, and that's what you need for Peace Pipe, for Wonderful Land and those sounds. You definitely don't want it for Apache. So for the early tunes,
up to 1960.
Yeah, up to about 1960. Either a top boost channel with the tone controls fully off, and you might then need to play with the tone control on your guitar or some other things to get really the right sound. For things like, and that followed through from Kon-Tiki through to about Blue Star, where they used the early AC-34, which again didn't have a top boost channel. But then when you move to Shadugi, Sleepwalk, Peace Pipe, Foot Tapper, Atlantis, those sorts of numbers, you need a top boost channel. You need that dip in frequency response at 800 hertz to really start getting the nasal sound and that follows through to the later numbers, as I mentioned. Then when they move into the Burns era, you can entirely, because
Miazzi I was going to get to.
I was too, because they used the Miazzi in the early Burns years.
Do they? Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right.
Zambezi, The Miracle, Lost City, clearly Miazzo echo patterns on there, you can hear it. And they used the Miazzi right up to the middle 65s, with The Sound of the Shadows was probably the last album where you can hear the Miazzi repeats. But you lead us into the critical thing. During that whole period, they had different guitars, they had different amps. They still had Hank, of course, but he was evolving as time went on. But the common factor was, in fact, the Miazzi echo unit. And there are really two aspects of that. One is the Miazzi preamp itself adds a critical element to that core tone. The second part of it is the actual echoes and the repeats and all of those things that characterise that echo. But you have to really have those two things. Just having accurate echoes and repeats won't give you that sound. You really need to have
the combination of the two things.
Yes.
So was this the drum Miazzi we're talking about, or was that part of that particular period?
Yeah. Good point. I mean, all of these early Miazzi echo units were, as Spiro said, a drum unit. We're used to tape recorders with tape going past heads. These early ones actually had a drum like that with a magnetic coating on it, and that spun and went around the heads. But the recording and replay process was still fundamentally magnetic tape.
So around the drum?
Around the drum, yeah. Miazzi stopped producing those because there were all sorts of reliability problems. And
they're kind of designed to wear themselves out.
Yes, that's right. And they were really not built very well at the end of the day. And they did wear out, and I mean, Hank's team tried sticking tape around the drum, and that extended their life a little bit. But I think one of them actually caught fire on stage at one of the Palladium performances, I think it was.
I didn't know that.
I'd like to have seen that.
Miazzi stopped producing the drum units, and then they produced tape units, but they had different head spacings then. And a lot of people now use modified Miazzi tape units. Just because it's got Miazzi written on it doesn't necessarily mean, though, you're going to get that sound, unfortunately, because what we've found with a lot of the units we've analysed is some of the tape units at least have it and some don't. And what we've found is there's certain ways that they're set up that give that magic ingredient. The problem for us all is, of course, you can't go down to the local high street music shop and buy a Miazzi to get that sound.
This is very true. So what can you do, Paul?
Well, a number of people have tried to provide modern equivalents to the Miazzi. And some have got fairly close to their echo timings and all of that sort of thing. But they still haven't got that characteristic Miazzi sound. And the interesting thing about a Miazzi is you can change its character simply on how hard you play it, how hard you drive. It's really a musical instrument itself. You don't just turn it on, plug in and get it. If you want really clean echoes that ring through in the background, you have a low level of drive. If you want to thicken up the sound and get less distinct clicky echoes, you increase the drive.
And that gives you more natural compression as well?
That's right. Distortion, compression, all of that sort of thing. And that's what makes these units so remarkable, in that they can change their character depending upon how you play it. The digital units which are being produced so far don't do that. If you play louder, you tend to get louder. If you play softer, you get softer, but you don't get that wide change in tonal complexity as you drive it.
Don't they have like on the RC?
Yeah, people are trying to get that, and with solid state units and with amp modelling, you can now get fairly close. But again, the difference is, do you want an amp modeler or do you want a valve amp with a Vox speaker in it? That really is the difference. You can get close with one, but the real thing with the playability you get with the real thing. So we spent a lot of time looking at it, and finished up developing a unit which is called a TVS Three, which actually emulates exactly that playable characteristic. It emulates the dynamic response of the Miazzi. It emulates the way Spiro said, as you play louder and louder or drive them harder, the echoes become more compressed, they become thicker, they become more distorted. And if you drive it really hard, it really gets very thick and lumpy. And some of the Shadows sounds use that thick and lumpy sound. Other ones tended not to.
So why don't the Shadows get that sound now? It seemed to disappear.
Yes, it did, and many people have commented on this. And again, you can learn a lot about the origins of that sound by answering the question. When they recorded Apache, it came out on record, obviously, when we first heard it, and it had that sound that we identify. They subsequently played it live on one of the Crackerjack programs in 1960, and it was the same sound. It was there. We were drooling over that sound. When they started performing live through the 60s, through the early middle 60s, sometimes it wasn't there. We'd go along to concerts and would suddenly be disappointed. And again, when you listen to those particular things and to the Crackerjack record, firstly with Apache, the strings are very dead. Sounds like they've been boiled in brill cream or something.
Or rubbed in it.
Or rubbed in it, yes. No sustained. The best way you can reproduce that now is by damping the strings slightly when you play it. The very dead sounding strings. When they did the Crackerjack in the early shows, they were still using the same amps, the AC-15 amplifiers. Now, in later shows from, say, about early 1961 onwards, they started using top boost amps. And when you're doing a live show, you don't want to be swapping between top boost channels and normal channels. So they tended to set it up for a generic sound, a Wonderful Land sort of sound. And as I said earlier on, that doesn't give you Apache. You can play the notes.
That's
you
dead
don't
right.
get that
That's
sound.
dead right.
We all went along to this last concert that they had, and they had a TVS. They had a Strat, and they had good pickups fitted to the Strat. And they had some lovely reproduction Vox amps, but they had them set up again for the generic sound. Now, I suppose they could have used channel switching, and they could have done that sort of thing.
I could add something to that, because I think one of the problems that Hank had with that was, once you set the sound that he wanted on the bridge pickup, if you then swapped to the net pickup, it would have been far too bassy. And the only way around that would have been to have had two amplifiers.
That's right. And in fact, you needed a complete setup for each tune. And of course, you can't do that in a live performance. You just have to do something generic and run with it.
So they stuck with the bridge.
Bridge and in some cases middle.
But very rarely did he venture ever into in his live performance. So, could Hank achieve it now? Yes. We could set up for Hank to play any of his early numbers using the appropriate amp settings, using the right sort of guitar settings as well. And if we could convince him to play in the old style, it would be there.
Very hard to be 19 again.
Very hard to be 19 again. We wish. However, there will be some demonstrations we'll put on right at the end of this video that actually compare us directly with the original Apache, with the original Wonderful Land, the original Atlantis, three of the characteristic Shadows sounds. And so you can see that, in fact, with the right equipment and setting up, you can actually achieve that sound.
Supposing you wanted to record a sound file and post it on one of the websites, is it a case of just bunging a microphone in front of a speaker?
Yes.
What do you do?
It would be lovely if it were that easy. It would have saved us thousands of hours trying to emulate the early sounds. even if you had all of this equipment, if you then set it up in your bedroom and stuffed a microphone in front, your chances of getting really the recorded sound right are pretty minimal. And a very interesting thing anybody can try at home is simply set it up, arrange it so that you can listen to what's being recorded through earphones. And either, if you're multidextrous, pluck the guitar while you move the microphone, or get someone to pluck the guitar. Move the microphone from the middle of the speaker slowly out to the edge. And that's your biggest tone control. It will go from thin and brittle out to muffled and
What about in and out? Close to the cloth?
Normally, for home recording, you want to have very close mic techniques, otherwise you get too much room ambience. So normally the microphone you'd have very close to the cloth. But as you move it from the middle of the cone out to the edge, you get this enormous difference. And so if you want to get something that's really bright, something like Atlantis, strangely enough, is actually quite a bright sound, you'll need to be on the axis. If you want to get something further that's got more dull sorts of sounds, you'll have to move out towards the edge. So you need to be very careful about where you put the microphone.
And Paul, what about wow flutter when you're changing things around to get, you know, where you want to get to?
Well, that's important. Spiro's referring to this phenomena with the tape recording process where the speed isn't completely uniform, so you actually get changes of pitch and subtle other effects as the speed varies by very small amounts, and that's called wow and flutter. And the early tape recorders were very, very bad at that.
Hank didn't use it on the tour, did he?
No, but the early Miazis did have wow and flutter, and that was because of the way the drum in the machine was turned by a little rubber idler wheel. Every time it went round, it caused pitch changes, and there were other mechanical effects in there as well. Interestingly, if that's a key part, again, of getting the singing sort of quality of many of the shadow sounds, if you don't have wow and flutter on the echoes, they combine with the dry signal in a very dry way. They just all come in together. With wow and flutter, the whole thing sings when you've got that recombination. Again, we spent a lot of time analysing what Miazzi machines we could find, and also the sound on the original records that used the drum machine, so that we could start to understand how much wow and flutter there was, and we've modelled that in the TVS so that it gives that same singing quality. And that's one thing that distinguishes really the TVS from many other units.
I can actually hear the difference when I have it versus not having it. I hear a big difference.
It sings on the one hand.
It does, it sings. That's that singing quality, isn't it, basically?
But interestingly enough, on this very subject, I know that Hank doesn't like it because I think he saw it as a fault, which of course it was.
It was, yes. That's in the early tape recorders, we would have done anything to get rid of the flutter. Yes, but it was a key thing in producing the sound that he had. And you're right, Hank now doesn't like it because he still hears it as a defect. And I had to turn it off for the setup of his machines in this last concert because he didn't like it, and that did detract from the sound. But hey, he pays the bills. So.